Hi, I'm Dennis Metzler, and welcome to The Charge. Today we're taking a look at intentional communities with Dr. Luther E. Smith, Professor Emeritus of Church and Community from Emory's Candler School of Theology, and the author of the book, Intimacy and Mission, Intentional Community as Crucible for Radical Discipleship. Dr. Smith, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Dennis, for this invitation.
Alrighty, so to get started, if you could just give us kind of a brief orientation of your own theological views, denominational church traditions, however you want to describe it.
I grew up in the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. Until 1954, it was called the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, a church that primarily has Southern roots, but then spread to the west as well as to the north, especially as you had Black migration occurring out of the South. My local church was one that was so crucial to my own formation. I felt it was a second family for me. If there was anything that I would do that might be embarrassing, I would worry as much about what the local church would think as my immediate household. But I am so indebted to that experience of long church involvement. It eventually led to my deciding to go into ministry. And so I'm also an ordained minister in the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. I had my theological education at Eden Theological Seminary, which is a denomination, it's affiliated with a denomination of the United Church of Christ, and had as some really seminal figures in my own formation, persons like reading Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich. Martin Luther King Jr. was very engaged in the works that James Cone provided for us as he was developing Black theology. I think a major person for me, both in terms of my own formation as well as my scholarship, has been Howard Thurman, a 20th century mystic who has, I think, been someone who was a significant influence on our lives. He was a mentor to Martin Luther King Jr., the first African-American to meet with Gandhi. And there's so much about my own spiritual quest that is related to the mentoring of Howard Thurman.
All right, good. So as far as your book, Intimacy and Communion, what is the background behind that? What led you to do the research and write that book?
That too grows out of my investment in the local church, where I would hear in sermons and Sunday school lessons and people's just testimony about how important it was for us to be deeply committed. I would hear that if we just gave more of ourselves to our religious convictions, we could change the world. And it was not just a matter of hearing that. There was, for me, a personal sense of believing it. And I wanted to test it. And intentional communities were a place where people's commitment is quite intense. Persons have been giving their all in terms of their time, their financial resources, where they are going to live. And it's intentional communities reflected for me that place where one comes to an understanding of the meaning of intense commitment as the possibility for transformation. So I embarked upon this research looking at intentional communities that were not only about bringing people together to deepen their own spiritual lives, certainly that, and their own ways of being on the faith journey, certainly that, but also people who are committed to the transformation of society itself, which has been, for me, my fundamental understanding of Christianity, that Jesus was about this process of not only being in ministry to individuals, yes, that, and bearing testimony to God's compassion, also to God's passion about justice. And growing up throughout the civil rights movement and other significant movements for justice, that's been so fundamental to my own understanding of faith, and certainly fundamental to the way in which I perceive Christianity itself. So these communities that I selected, 5 communities, reflect that commitment of not only focusing on one's spiritual formation, but also attending to God's call of prophetic engagement with the issues of the larger community, especially around matters of compassion and justice.
And how would you define Christian intentional community? What are the earmarks?
Intentional communities have a wide range of characteristics. There are those which are not in any way interested in the social transformation of the areas around them or the world itself. And there are those who really understand their purpose for coming together to be that of transformation. I think fundamental to all of them is some level of covenant, where members in the community are deeply committed, certainly to the mission of the community, but also to one another, and who have some understanding of who I will be for you, which is a fundamental understanding of covenant, not just what I will do for you, because what I will do will grow out of who I will be, but who will I be for you in this covenantal relationship, as together we understand ourselves as being called by God for the particular mission of this community. And every community has a mission, even though as you would look at one, it may be very different than another, but every community has a sense of mission. And the ones on which I focused were those communities that really understood that their own Christian faith was essentially connected to the transformation of their immediate communities, especially, but also, as with sojourners, having some impact upon the nation and the world.
All right. And what would you say then is the biblical basis, the biblical theology behind Christian community?
I think it's evident in both the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament. This call for justice, which the prophets are continually reminding people is God's heart. It's in Jesus's ministry. It's certainly healing individuals in terms of their woundedness, but also recognizing people who are suffering under conditions of oppression. And Jesus is speaking against that kind of impact on persons. There's a book that I think is really important to me personally, but is also one that very much inspired those who were deeply involved in the civil rights movement. It's Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited. And this understanding that Jesus understood himself to be one of the disinherited with a mission to the disinherited, not just to those who were the inherited and what they ought to do out of compassion for the disinherited, but immediately to the disinherited. And that's an important understanding of Jesus, which means it's an important understanding for me of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And I think what the Christian faith itself should be about. So the biblical roots for this are deep. And my own question emerges, what is the biblical roots for not being engaged in the issues of justice and transformation in society? That I don't find.
So wouldn't Acts, early part of the book of Acts, especially chapter 2 and chapter 4, be identified by a lot of intentional communities as foundational for them?
Yes, I think foundational in terms of what it means to form community, and the significance of the church as an expression of community. But a number of intentional communities take as a kind of biblical model for their economic structures and what it means to live the simple life, Acts 2. And then there are communities that are inspired by Acts, but at the same time do not feel that Acts 2 is necessarily calling them into the kind of economic arrangements that are suggested there. But you're right. That can be such an exemplary scripture for many of the communities, even for those who do not necessarily feel that it's their calling to be living in the same household, caring for one another in terms of economic arrangements, and having that kind of intense collective life together. There are such different expressions of community that are available for those who feel called to be with others in this work of Christian fellowship as well as Christian mission.
All right. I've also noticed that a lot of communities will refer to the one another's throughout the epistles. And we're called to encourage one another, hold each other accountable, love one another. And what structures does it take then to actually facilitate living out the one another's? And that's why some communities live the way they do, so they can function that way, so they can fully live out the one another's.
It's accountability is as I would say diverse in these communities as it is in the local church. You can have intense expressions of accountability in a community like Messiah out of Detroit, Michigan. Messiah Episcopal Church had this intentional community expression, and people would not only live in the same household, but they would have these sessions of accountability for one another. And if someone had said something or acted in a way that was felt to be against the grain of the community, they would gather and meet and discuss this, taking seriously holding one another accountable, but also taking seriously some psychological approaches to group dynamics. And it was both, I think, something of the charism of the community, but it also became the bane of the community because people felt that, meeting at 6 o'clock in the morning to begin to process personal issues was not an inspiring way to start the day. And so the community itself recognized that what it had embraced at one point in time was no longer serving the purposes, that you, in many ways, are experimenting with what it means to hold one another accountable in ways that are helpful to the individual, but also in ways that are nurturing for the community. And something that perhaps worked in the early life of the community is discovered to not be as helpful later, sometimes because the membership has changed, but sometimes because those who have been involved in this just find this to be something that is outdated. They've moved on, and they need some different way of relating to one another creatively to hold one another accountable that reflects how their own lives have changed. They may have started off as individuals who were single, and now they're married with children. And that's a huge shift, not only in identity, but in life rhythms and the kind of time that one has available, the whole notion of intimacy that is not just, let's say, with another community member, but is with one's spouse. That you're not simply dealing with how are we as single people working collectively on these community issues that have some bearing on our time, but how are these community issues about which we feel so deeply sensitive to our family dynamics and how those matters are changing. So one of my insights in looking at communities is how they all are having to take seriously the transitions that are part of every community, the life transitions. Even if you had a community where no one left, you would be dealing with all kinds of life transitions that come about just from aging, or the way in which people's attitudes begin to change over time. And it's
the way their finances change.
Finances change, the external realities that come upon a community. So the extent to which a community has the capacity to read these times and be creatively responsive will sometimes determine the capacity of a community to have a longer life, or its capacity to live with the frustrations of people feeling as if somehow or another the community is out of sync with what needs to be occurring.
Well, everybody cannot stay in their 20s for their whole life, as much as they may want to. But so the book is about intentional community, but it's also about radical discipleship. So how would you define radical discipleship?
Basically, discipleship, as I write in this book, is about how we are following Jesus. And the word radical, the root for radical, radical has the root word in Latin that is about roots. And it can mean that you are pulling up things by the root, which is considered radical, or you're going to the roots, you're nurturing the roots, you're sustaining the roots. And it avoids simply characterizing radical as being extreme and expression, and especially callous to the way things are now. It's about care for roots and the willingness to pull up those roots that are failing what one is seeking to harvest out of life. And unfortunately, I have felt that so much of the life of people in the church has not been attentive to this. We like to focus on roots of scripture and roots of tradition and roots of worship, while we have been inattentive to those things that have been part of the life and deeply rooted in our life that really fail the faith itself, the kind of materialism that I think has taken over many churches, the kind of understanding of authority that seems more oriented to the preacher and leadership, the ways in which so much of our church life has felt to be a kind of accommodation to the realities of the larger culture, rather than taking seriously. There are times in which our faith is in critical relationship to what is occurring in the larger culture. And so it's this sense in which radicals are often seen as being really out of sorts with, I think, the institutional church, because there is so much of what they are doing in intentional communities that is perceived as a critique of what is happening in the church, and it is. And there is so much occurring in these intentional communities that is perceived to be attending to the roots of how the church was formed. And I think that that is also true. What I find to be interesting, and interesting is an interesting word you can use in 1,000 different ways. But what really motivated my work with this was to identify why have institutional churches so often been dismissive of intentional communities, when it has seemed to me that this is what our first communities were all about. And intentional communities have been part of the Christian heritage throughout all time of Christianity itself. And we have periods where there are explosions of these Christian communities, and periods where that's not so much the case. But to assume that the institutional models that we have of the case of the church are the only models of the church is, I think, a failing in our imagination, as well as a failing in our understanding of our history.
Yeah, it's always interested me. Any book I look at on ecclesiology, what is the church all about? I see nothing about intentional communities or house churches or alternative ways of doing church. That's just such a minority that we might as well just ignore them.
Right.
So,
go
ahead.
My writing, my research and my writing was with the intention that there is so much that the institutional church can learn from intentional communities. Intentional communities, I think, are experiments that are instructive and inspiring. And I believe there are many lessons for intentional communities to learn from the institutional church.
Yes.
And I believe that every institutional church needs to have intentionality, even if it's not adopting various forms of intentional community. It needs to have intentionality in order to be about the work to which God has called it, without sliding into or slipping into modes of institutionalism that fail what we have decided to embrace and follow in who Jesus is for us.
All right. So you write about the circumstances, both ecclesiastical and historical, surrounding the founding of some of these communities. What seems to exist prior in the culture of the church, et cetera, that gives rise to these communities?
One of the important motivations for forming these communities is there are so many who have found in their local churches a complete resistance to prophetic calling, that their churches are so accommodated to cultural matters that the church postures itself to not be offensive to the larger community, to not be offensive to members who themselves are deeply rooted in certain cultural trends related to economics, related to people living in poverty, related to issues of violence in the larger society, and who have stands that one might find it very difficult to associate with what Jesus was about. And so they are not giving up on Christianity, but they are believing that the institutional churches with which they are associated are not the containers of that Christianity, that the faith is so much more dynamic and expressive than what they have experienced in their local churches. And I'm very careful about expressing it this way because I'm not wanting to characterize all local churches, all institutional churches, as somehow or another representing this caricature of local churches. But many, if not most, are in some way not intentional in mission regarding the prophetic call upon the church, the possibilities for compassion upon the church, the significance of being a caring neighbor to those who are certainly immediate to where you are, as well as those beyond where you are. Failing that, they have decided that their sense of what it means to be a Christian needs to have expression in a very different structure and aligned with people who are like-minded about this, who are as committed as they are, and that working together, this could be the best use of their lives. Many think of it as a place where they would hopefully have a lifelong commitment. But for some, I think it's a place of testing to see if this particular expression of community can in many ways be fulfilling in terms of their effort to be faithful.
And beyond that, I mean, people may have a sense we need to do something different. There's got to be more. We want to live as family. This is too empty. But then what are the real key factors to actually get a community off the ground and make it viable?
Well, here you come into all of the human dimensions of personality that are at play in any organization, any effort to work collectively together. And it can be really important for persons to listen to one another in terms of what motivates joining, what persons aspire to have occur, as mission is being identified within the context of a community, that persons feel heard, that this is a place where I'm just not asked to be a follower, which is, the communities in which I looked are very different than cults, where people are joining primarily, let's say, to follow an individual who is perceived to have all the authority that is needed to be guidance for the members of the community. In the communities on which I focus, it's persons believing that community itself has an element of authority, and that their participation in the community is going to be a crucial voice in helping to shape that, as well as to provide guidance for that, understanding that God is the only authority for how this community will be going forward. And therefore, our work is to be so prayerfully engaged that we are seeking to discern God's will for us, rather than having the imposition of someone's ideas about that, to asking for the rest of us to conform to it. So that kind of listening to one another and feeling heard and sensing that I'm actually giving shape to the life of this community and to which I'm willing to enter in a covenantal relationship is really crucial, because beyond that, you then get the various structures of community. What will the economics of our community be? What will the authority structure of our community be? Where will the location of our community be? What will the expectations for relating to the outside world be? What are you doing with the resources I bring to the community? All of these complicated matters that are involved in being an intentional community often considerably more matters than a decision about joining a local church, will often decide whether a community has vitality or whether it's a community that's characterized by constant conflict.
So, how essential is it to have that one person that really leads the way that people can gather around and trust?
Oh, well, basically, what I'm saying, any orientation around the one person becomes problematic.
But does it get off the ground if you don't have that one person?
There are individuals that can be inspiring. For example, Clarence Jordan in the Koinonia community, I think is an inspiring figure. And many members of the Sojourners community are inspiring. John Perkins, so inspiring, of the community in Mississippi. Those individuals can draw people to a community. Those individuals are appreciated, I think, in terms of what wisdom and commitment they bring. But in the communities on which I focused, it was not long before other members of the community were really clear that you are one of us. We, one of the issues that Clarence Jordan had was how often he was being called outside of the community to be a speaker. And conflicts emerged in Koinonia because other members would say, wait a minute, so you get to go to all these places and you're doing, and meanwhile, the rest of us are back here doing the work of farming and attending to the conflicts that are occurring not only within the community, but are coming to our community. And those kinds of distinctions become very problematic for the kinds of community on which I focus, that were really not wanting a kind of individual who in many ways was claiming leadership authority that especially, let's say, was the decider on many matters. They could respect the gifts of someone like a Clarence Jordan in terms of speaking and writing. At the same time, they were wanting an individual to understand that the very thing that we respect, that is a draw for some people, does not constitute privileges within this community. And we look for you to be living according to the covenant of arrangements that we have understood hold us together. And they are very suspicious about exceptions to what is expected of each member of the community.
So you write a lot about community and calling. You talk about being called to be a peculiar people, to a particular place, and to an unknown future. Could you fill that in more for us?
Yeah, the peculiar people term is one that John Winthrop used in characterizing what it meant for them to be coming to this colony in America that where they could be expressing their faith fully, and the sense in which we have something distinctive in terms of being a people of faith that needs a place such as this in order to flourish. And I think that's the way in which many communities think of themselves, that they are peculiar, especially in light of most institutional churches. And in fact, so peculiar that many institutional churches are willing to characterize intentional communities as cults without knowing anything about them. They're just, if you're not aligned with us, you're a cult. And this, of course, is a issue for the communities in the neighborhoods in which they existed, that people, neighbors, would often think or wonder is this a cult that's now among us, even when these communities did not have the characteristics of a cult? And these were communities that were wanting for people to join in their life, and they wanted to join in the life of the people. What is difficult for all of these communities is this criterion of membership. And when you have qualities of membership that involve individuals, in some sense, giving up their old ways of just living every day to the new ways of the community, to some people, that's just cult by definition. And so communities always were, in some sense, defining and redefining themselves, and over time relying upon neighborhood people being their best voices in saying they're not a cult. They understand themselves to be doing something profoundly Christian. They are living together in order to be exemplary of this model of the Christian faith. They're okay. They are our peculiar neighbors. And so the term peculiar is, I think, indicating how distinctive they are in so many ways in which they live, as well as so many ways in which they understand what it means to be the church. And this understanding of to a particular place is taking seriously that faith is in many ways a kind of act of prophetic stewardship where one is located. That we're not talking about what does it mean to be a Christian in some remote area of the world, but what does it mean to be a Christian where you are seeing people, interacting with people in the various businesses of people, when you see their suffering immediately, when you know them by name and they know you by name, and how might this kind of interaction in a particular place be understood as an expression of faith, not just a strategy to have the community known, but it's an understanding of who God has called us to be, where we are. So this calling is both to the individual, but it's also a calling to the community. And communities would often do discerning about what is the location for our commitment, and to take seriously that God's calling to a particular place is that which is a matter for deep discernment and a matter for them to be giving themselves to. To give you an example of the conflict that can occur for a member who doesn't understand that sufficiently, it's one thing, let's say, if you are drawn to the charismatic life of Messiah as a community, and then you understand that Messiah understands its mission as also being to the immediate community where there is a great deal of impoverishment, people are dealing with food scarcity, and there are all sorts of needs in that local community, as well as justice issues, with the expectation that you're living in the community. If you're not attuned to this particular place being a dimension of mission, there's going to be something more than frustration. There's going to be a kind of depression about the way in which there's you've missed the alignment with what this community is about. Though you've been so drawn to its charismatic worship and even drawn to the individuals, if you haven't been drawn to the particular place, things are going to be just very disturbing for you, and it's going to be a problem for you as an individual, and it's going to be a problem for the community that is perhaps maybe you haven't even been explicit about your complaint about the community, but you're giving expression to this sense in which this is not your place in a variety of ways, the kinds of things you're not willing to volunteer to do, the way in which you may be arguing about the deployment of time, the fact that you're being required to live in the area. You don't mind caring about the area, but you don't see why living in the area is essential to the commitment of this community. It's those kinds of things that make an understanding of a particular place important. And,
that's
and
probably
the future aspect of this is, in many ways, when you join a community, you cannot predict where this community is going. The community itself cannot predict what will be unfolding in the next year or 2 years or 3 years. You can wish, you can anticipate, but you cannot predict. And in many ways, communities are saying that unlike an institutional church where Sunday after Sunday, year after year, you might expect the same rhythms, this is not the case with us. And we need to adjust to that. And anyone who's joining needs to know that.
Yeah, I was going to say probably the geographical proximity, the focus on a place is maybe perhaps the biggest distinction, or that and commitment to the institutional church and to intentional communities. It's like, no, we are in a place here. We are focused on this neighborhood. So say more about covenant. That's a very key concept for intentional communities. And along with that, you talk about convictions, structures, and especially commitment.
Covenant is so basic to the biblical understanding of faith itself. God saying, I will be your God and you will be my people. And this covenant relationship then also relates to what does it mean for us to be a people who remember the laws, and a people who remember the stories, and a people who remember the prophets, and a people who remember the covenant. And the anger that gets expressed through the prophets in the biblical narrative is an anger about forgetting or ignoring the covenant that was made, who we will be, who God is, and the covenant of who God has said God will be with us and for us. And if that is forgotten, then you don't have the faith. You have perhaps some reconstruction of who God is that is convenient, but not a relationship with the true God. And so covenant is fundamental to the social arrangements. We have them in marriage relationships. We have them in friendships. And the understanding being that in many ways, this is an expression of my full self. This is not a contractual relationship of you do this, I'll do that. They are important, but that's a very, very different understanding of what we're about than just a contractual relationship. But how am I giving my full self to you and to our joint commitment? And that joint commitment in intentional communities can certainly entail to everyone in the life of the community as much as possible, who constitute the mission of the community, and where the sense of not just covenantal relationship begins to break down, but also the sense that covenantal relationship is being attended to, that you're not just saying we all made some vow a year or 2 or 3 years ago, and that's going to make it hold. And if there isn't some attention to sustaining the covenant, if there isn't some attention to prophetic voices within the community that are reminding the people that, we seem to be ignoring this, we have forgotten that, then you don't have community with integrity. It's evolved into something else, which is not to speak against a community evolving, but it's very different if a community evolves away from being a covenantal relationship versus a community that's evolving within its covenantal relationship to discover perhaps new approaches to how it wants to be in mission, or new approaches about its housing arrangements or its economic arrangements. All of that can be an important evolution in the life of a community that grows out of attention to the deepest commitment of covenant. But where the covenant commitment itself has been ignored, or where the covenant commitment itself has been taken for granted, then you're in trouble as a community. And this is where I think so many communities have a critique of institutional churches. I know when I've done consulting for churches and have asked, what is the covenantal commitment of members to one another? You would have thought that when I mentioned the word covenant, I was speaking about some forgotten foreign language. And, I asked the question, what does it mean that even the term covenant is in some ways lost to the most fundamental meaning of what it means for us to be together as church?
And so say more about commitment then, how you can have a covenant. We can agree on this covenant, but then how the commitment is lived out, what sort of accountability there is, what sort of emphasis is placed on commitment.
Sure. Well, commitment is one of these matters that can have such varied meanings within even an intentional community. And one of my insights over the years, even since my focus on intentional communities, has been how perhaps what is very threatening to the life of a local church, or what is very threatening to the life of an intentional community, is not the fact that you have people who are deeply committed and people who are not deeply committed. It's having people, all of whom are deeply committed, and who question the commitment of the others. And this is the cause of conflict and turmoil, not the lack of commitment, but the different visions of commitment and the ways in which they address that kind of difference, often with conflict, intentional conflict, as well as perhaps unintentional conflict, but conflict nonetheless that becomes destructive in the life of the community. So, at the very outset of our conversation, I spoke about just the desire to see what would occur in a context where people were all in with their commitment. And what for me became a real insight from this is, such contexts are wonderful for having images of the Christian faith that are just inspiring in ways that seem like this is it. And to also discover that intensity of commitment can be such a source of draining the energy of people, of folks deciding to leave with severe criticisms about the community itself, where you get the efforts to address the conflict in what we would consider to be some unchristian ways. such that the intensity of commitment is important, but I think we are prone for disappointment and also prone for being misled if we assume that in and of itself will be sufficient to to really be that which holds the community together.
So you have a quote from Howard Thurman that one of the dangers with commitment is that people are committed to the commitment. Can you clarify that? Say more about that?
It's true with any kind of covenantal, I think, relationship or any kind of commitment that draws upon our deepest selves for involvement. As Howard Thurman was expressing it, we can make an idol of commitment. And when you make an idol of commitment, you can have more of a commitment to the commitment than you have a commitment to God. And this is where discernment is crucial for us, I think, in all of these endeavors, especially a covenantal endeavor. How is this relationship to which I committed myself a month ago, a year ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago? How is this relationship an expression of who God has called me to be, who God has called us to be? And after seeking to be as creative and as engaged as I've understood God has prepared me to be, that the relationship is no longer a bearer of the calling itself. How am I able to shake the dust off my feet and move on in a way that is faithful to God and not just faithful to the commitment that I made previously? Of course, what you're always dealing with is people who can then take that understanding and twist it in a way to suggest that, that just becomes an excuse from walking away from a commitment. No, that's not what we're talking about. It's not it's not the effort to have an easy way out from the travails and the real hard effort there is that's part of any covenantal relationship. It's not that. It's not a matter of when things get rough, then the rough go. No, but it is a recognition that we can find ourselves in a place, in a time where that to which God is calling us is not this particular place and not this particular time. And that's not only for intentional communities, it's for the institutional church. And I've had students who struggled with their institutional church not affirming them for ministry. And I have insisted that if God has a calling upon your life, you have to pay attention to that calling and not just assume that the vote of the church has canceled God's calling upon your life. Even though perhaps that institutional church had been very affirming of you previously, but no longer is, your life response is to God, and that's a response to the covenant you have with God, which is hopefully that which has priority over any other covenantal relationship that's been made.
So tied closely to covenant and commitment are membership and authority, two issues that can also be very thorny in intentional community. What's essential for us to understand here?
It's it's very difficult in intentional communities to um, to to determine what should be the criteria by which someone becomes a member, because the community life itself is so intense and can be so time consuming, so energy consuming. Even if you're working with people who have been on board for some time, to have someone come in and perhaps have one image of the community, but once they are fully involved, have a different image of community. Such an individual can be disruptive for the whole life of the community. And so communities can be very attentive to the kind of criteria by which they are able to discern an individual's match for this community. It can be a process that goes on for a year or more, and people can be moving through phases and have discussions with committees that are doing some mentoring and some discerning about someone's eligibility for membership. But it's an effort to make the process of entering one in which this individual is also able to make a more informed decision, as well as the community. Because once you're in a community, it's also an obligation for the community, as well as your obligation to the community. So, but from those who are on the outside, who are thinking about what it means to have membership in an institutional church, such a criteria, such a process can be perceived as the kinds of things that they associate with cults. You know, it's you run the gauntlet, and an outsider might perceive this to be, they want to be sure you're going to follow our authority and what you're told to do. From the outside, it can be perceived as, oh, this is where the brainwashing takes place. This is where people get shaped into leaving all of these other things we know to be important behind. And membership can then be very hard, because as they develop relationships with neighbors, and neighbors are very, very excited about members of the community and what they're doing, but also feel like there's a barrier into the most intimate aspect of a community's life, where people are gathered and cultivating group life together. It may be the household, or it may be within the community itself, where they really are not wanting people who are not members to be part of that. But they also are aware how that kind of restriction is leading others to perceive them as being exclusive. And that becomes a difficult barrier to get through. So membership is important. The process of membership is crucial for the vitality of the community. And membership can also be the kind of process and the kind of status that is complicated for a community in a particular area.
And then along with that, authority.
Yeah, and this is, some of this we've spoken about before, that being in the communities where I was focused, the idea that authority truly resides with the community itself. And, you know, there may be committees with certain levels of authority, maybe over household matters, or the economics, or the extent to which people have been faithful in terms of, you know, showing up for their responsibilities. They have been very, very clear that authority does not rest with only one person. And authority should not rest with even one committee if others have not, in some way, felt that this committee has been operating according to what we understand to be the covenantal commitment of all of us to the community itself. So authority is that is spread out can be helpful, and authority that is spread out can be very complicating when you need an immediate decision about, let's say, an individual who has shown herself or himself to be needing to actually not be involved in community matters. It may be their own emotional issues, or a decision needs to be made regarding some legal matter regarding the community, and there's not the kind of time for processing, or someone decides there's a protest going on and we need to show up for that, and people show up, but maybe the whole community hasn't really agreed this is where our witness is. And now you have given us publicity that we didn't ask for as a community. It's those kinds of issues of authority that communities are dealing with. That can be frustrating at times, especially as you establish committees that are hopefully understood to be processing difficult issues through the community structure. As I had mentioned about Sojourners, at one time they had more committees than their 20 members. And so, you can understand what kind of burden that can be on an individual's time, as well as just the process of keeping up with all of those committees.
Wow. Okay, so you spent a lot of time focused on the social transformation of the communities around them. You focused on communities that were dealing with neighborhoods or people that were living on the margins of poverty, et cetera. So first of all, two parts of the question. What's the biblical basis for this sort of engagement? And then what are the methods that these communities used?
The communities were taking seriously, I mentioned Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited. The communities were taking seriously the biblical narrative around issues of oppression and injustice and compassion, especially what we had heard in Latin American theology as God's preferential option for the poor, and gave themselves to that. And these are often the communities that seemed so vulnerable to just matters of basic survival. And they discovered that the government was not paying sufficient attention to, there were not enough nonprofits that could be responsive to the needs. And communities would be involved in such things as gardening to provide nourishment to members of the community. So they'd have these community gardens, or providing clothing banks for people in the community, having weekends where there would be food available for persons, especially those that, let's say, had helped to create a kind of collective of purchasing items that could be dispersed among those who had some membership in this particular way of getting bulk items into their families. Communities would often be responsive to children and their needs. And so there would be summer programs for children. There would be back to school initiatives for children. There would be mentoring for children. the needs of the children were something that was addressed in every community that I focused upon. And the ability to have outreach to the adults in the community sometimes came through the children. The kinds of needs that were being met by the communities were needs that went beyond what the family could provide, or an individual in the family could provide. And these communities were there to be helpful in those ways. And then you have a community like Sojourners, which understood itself to not only be responsive to neighborhood needs, but to have a magazine that's addressing such issues as war and poverty and mass incarceration and the kind of other crises that are perceived as occurring around the nation that are failing to have a people of faith addressing them in ways that indicate the prophetic call to be engaged in this. And so this sort of media involvement of Sojourners was also understood to be a way of calling attention to the issues of injustice, a preferential option for the poor, and the issues of compassion that are so often missed by many communities and many local churches. So the biblical roots for that were understood by all of these communities. These weren't just expressions of altruism. These weren't just expressions of some kind of social theory, but they were expressions of faith that there was no question about why we are doing this. This comes through the biblical narrative to us, and we have no reason to be apologetic about it or defensive about it. If anything, the issues of explanation fall more on local churches that are not doing this work than on us.
And did you find amongst the communities that you researched that there was an emphasis on personal spiritual growth and the disciplines and practices that would facilitate that?
Certainly. I mean, Sabbath was an expression in all of these communities. The work on Messiah, it was so interesting how, oh my goodness, so many times throughout the week, they would be attentive to not just the spiritual questions that people brought, but to perceptions of what's going on with someone spiritually and calling together the community to deal with that, especially beginning, let's say, in their household arrangements, but it could go beyond that. Looking at gaining counseling resources that went beyond the skills of a community, and communities identifying either among those who were not members of the community, but who were supporters of the community, the kinds of counseling resources that could be helpful to a member, or even going beyond those resources. Communities were taking seriously spiritual formation. There would be Bible study. There would be relationships with institutional churches of their community. So there wasn't some kind of wall between these communities and institutional churches. They welcomed it. They wanted it. They would, in many ways, work collaboratively with institutional churches. There weren't many, but those that were open to a collaborative work, those who appreciated what these communities were doing in their own neighborhoods or in a neighborhood across town, communities were very receptive to that. So whatever would be done out of the prophetic work of these communities was understood to be informed by the spiritual formation of its individuals. And of course, you can't even think about the prophets without thinking about their own spiritual formation. They are not just advocates about social conditions. They are speaking from their hearts, what they have discerned has come from God's heart. And this is, I think, to the credit of these communities, taking seriously the kind of attention and work that must be done about what's happening with individuals at a very personal level, that they may have some of the spiritual resources within the community, but what's happening to individuals at a personal level that may require more professional help, that are addressing perhaps some psychological, emotional type matters that go beyond the skill set of the community members.
So one key thing that draws so many people to intentional community is life together as family. Many people have come from dysfunctional families, or they just sense that there has to be something more than this. And it's not so much about the mission to the marginalized, but they want family. What have you found through your research what are the sort of practices and orientations that facilitate life together?
That can be very complicating for communities. This is one of the issues that relates to communities being very discerning about who becomes a member. Because if persons are really dealing with, let's say, an abusive parent, then they can easily transfer the identity of this parent onto a member of the community who's in authority. And when that happens, you may have some sense of what informs their reactions, or you may have no sense of what's informing their reactions. So the desire for family in these communities can be something that leads to a good deal of healing, where people experience something positive. It can be very complicating for the community if people are coming with such unresolved issues that they're looking for the community to address. And maybe a community isn't really prepared to attend to all of these issues. And communities are not, the communities at which I looked were not setting themselves up to say, we're here to address, all of these things that you're bringing. So this matter of looking for family is welcomed by the community if you're thinking of family as a nurturing place of intimacy, of care, of covenantal relationship. Fine. But we also know that there's no one typology of family that characterizes all the church members, that even characterizes the Bible. And so you can have people who are coming with some very difficult matters, and they're looking for something from the community that the community is not prepared to offer, even though the community itself may be working on being in some form or fashion a covenantal family. This whole term of family is often what churches will use. You are a family, and it gets broad. You are the family of God. And I know I began our conversation saying I thought of the church as my second family. But I also was really clear about what were the boundaries of my expectation for that over and against my home family. And I don't think that's always the case with people who are coming out of a sense of profound emotional, familial need.
And that can often be disguised because maybe some of the most apparently functional people in the community, including leadership, can have those issues deeply, but it's not recognized because they're the leaders, right?
Right.
So
Right.
it can be really tricky. But obviously, that's a big part of your book, mission and intimacy, right?
Yes.
So, all right. Wow. So finally, you wrote this book 30 years ago. I'm interviewing you on it today because I think it's still totally relevant. It's very important. But you've had 30 years more experience. You're still, I mean, you've been a professor of church and community. So you've learned a lot more. You've experienced more yourself. What can you tell us from your additional experience and research since writing the book that's relevant to all this?
All of the communities that I researched are in a very different place than they were then. And
they all exist at some level, which is very hopeful.
Yeah. And they were changing even over the 15 years in which I was engaged in this research. So that doesn't, that doesn't surprise me. It's the character of churches. It's especially the character of intentional communities that you have dramatic changes over a, quote, short period of time. What I have also felt as I have gone back through what was said in the book is that it all holds. It's the issues that were mentioned are issues that continue to occur within the life of the community. And there's nothing that I'm saying now is to suggest that communities themselves are fixed, because I'm clearly not saying that. Just as I've just said, they can take very different forms. They can, Sojourners no longer has the whole living arrangements and living community that they had. They redefined the meaning of community in a very different way. And so is the case for places like Patchwork Central, another community on which I focused. Dramatically different forms. What I find myself less convinced is similar to when I was writing 30 years ago, is the state of the institutional church. I think we're at a period where it's going through significant change. The statistics indicate increasing numbers of persons will speak of themselves as spiritual but not religious, a term which I have some issues with, but they speak of themselves as spiritual as not religious, which is another way of indicating that affiliation with a local church is not for them the way by which they see themselves being spiritual persons. I think there's been such disruption in the life of denominations, which means the disruption in the life of local churches, such searching for footing in a culture that itself is changing dramatically as to what kinds of expressions in the culture, in music, in media, other media, are acceptable, in notions of even national identity or what's happening internationally, life at the border, what's on the national agenda, what kind of political changes are acceptable, are people wanting, how we understand that some of the of the larger cultural discourse that we probably could not have imagined 30 years ago is occurring now in ways that so many people are feeling that the center is not holding and things are coming apart. And I, I'm not there to at the point of saying things are coming apart, but I do think things are dramatically different, and I do think things can come apart. But I've lived through periods of our history that have had dramatic change, that have been very devastating for people. And I think I can put up periods of our history as in terms of life being on the very edge that match what's going on at this particular point in time and what's been going on over the next 10, 15, 20 years. So for me, it's our institutional life of the church that feels so different than it did 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. So much more so than I think the kind of dynamics occurring with intentional communities. And I think there are periods in our life, especially in the 60s, especially in the 19th century, where we would have thought that the cultural changes would lead to an increase in intentional communities as places, not just of refuge, but as places of resurgence of energy and formation, as there is this need for, I think, a collective community. With our social media and its role in forming collective community for people in a way in which many of them do not seem to be calling that into question, but seeing virtual community as viable forms and expressions of community. I don't know. And I've even known intentional communities that have been raising that question. To what extent is virtual community addressing the needs of individuals as well as mission needs as viably as people coming together and living in a place? And might a virtual community be able to get at things that trying to live together, you don't have to deal with all that quote mess of these relationships of being in a home or being in a place and matters of neighbors, and we can just attend to that which has brought us together, which has been my long way of answering your question of feeling like for intentional communities, what is written, I think, has merit for communities that are forming today. But communities that are forming today are in a very, very different social climate than I think communities 30 years ago.
All right. Well, so much to consider and ponder, but yeah, I'm still convinced intentional communities are a very important movement to participate in. There's a lot of dangers, to be sure, a lot to be aware of, but it's so vital to the body of Christ. I'm Dennis Metzler. You've been listening to The Charge. We've been with Dr. Luther Smith, the author of Intimacy and Mission, Intentional Community as Crucible for Radical Discipleship. It's available below. Just follow the link. So, Dr. Smith, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right, peace to everyone. I'd love to hear from you. Please email me at thecharge.info@gmail.com. Please check out our other videos. Don't forget to hit like and click on subscribe.